Investors in Russia are pouring billions of dollars out of the country. Questions are being raised about who will be the next president. Are they running scared about the country's political future? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. The Russian President Dmitry Medvedev called on business leaders this week to decide whether they support him for a second term or want Putin back in the Kremlin. At least that's how some of them took it. And 8 months away from a presidential election, the country still doesn't know who will stand for the highest office. So far, President Dmitry Medvedev and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin are seen as contenders, but neither has made any official announcement, and the uncertainty may be affecting the country's economy. From Moscow, Neve Barker reports.
Russian investors are anxious. In the last few months, $30 billion has left the country. The economic trend even has a name: capital flight.
Capital flight. This is money being taken offshore by people who have had it here, people who have been investing here, perhaps people taking profits and bringing it offshore.
Russia's one of the few places in the world where foreign investors can buy into the country's massive oil, gas and natural resources wealth. But the outflow of money is happening even despite oil prices remaining high. The reason is all because of uncertainty in the corridors of power and a deep anxiety over who exactly will be the next Russian leader. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the country went through a series of social, economic and political upheavals that today are now largely under control. But the fear is a sudden shift of power could upset the balance.
There's uncertainty about who is going to be the president in Russia, and there's some concern that there could be change, and change worries people with a lot of money.
The race is expected to be run between the country's two most powerful men. President Dmitry Medvedev wants to see his plans for a modern economy through to the end. Vladimir Putin seen by many as offering stability. But who would investors prefer? And is there really much difference at all?
Foreign investors prefer to see Mr. Medvedev as president because they think he's a more liberal politician than Mr. Putin. But here in the country, we don't really see very much difference between these two people.
The Kremlin says the current capital outflow will end after the election, but they've told investors they could miss out if they wait. Global forecasts suggest Russia could become the world's fifth largest economy in a few years. But that hasn't stopped investors, for the time being at least, from playing it safe. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, back in June, Russian Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin admitted that investors were pulling out because of anxiety about the presidential election in March 2012. He said, in a moment like this, and when the political system is still imperfect, investors are trying to safeguard their reserves and investment. On Friday, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin reflected on his 11 years in power and acknowledged that elements of the system he created needed to change. He said stability is not the same as stagnation. It does not mean that we should not develop, that we should not implement innovative methods in administering the economy. In political life, it does not mean that we should stop the processes of democratization. Well, joining us now are our three guests in London: former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrasov, here in Doha, James Moore Jr., a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development and currently an international counselor at the strategic communications firm APCO. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a political analyst with Russia Profile magazine. Gentlemen, good to have you all with us. Alexander Nekrasov, if I could start with you. What do you think is behind this flight of capital out of Russia? Is it worries about who's going to be in charge, or is it something entirely different?
Well, I think that basically it has to do with the nervousness of all the markets around the world, because if you look at what's happening in Europe at the moment, it's basically on the verge of losing the euro. And in America, the situation is very difficult. The Middle East is in turmoil. So to say that money is running from Russia into some safer environment would be basically stupid. So in a sense, money has been coming backwards and forwards. And when you say foreign investors, don't forget that some of this money is actually Russian money coming from places like Cyprus and other. And these people are basically unpredictable. And I don't really think it has to do anything with the political future, because anyone who has been monitoring events in Russia for the past 3.5 years, would basically tell you that Putin is on his way back. So all this so-called confusion, which some people are talking about, I don't think it's actually happening.
Dmitry Babich, I know much of this debate that's been going on lately about who's going to be in charge and who's going to run for president next year began earlier this week with a story in the Russian press that said that the Russian President Dmitry Medvedev met with a number of prominent business leaders in the country. And what came out of that conversation, according to some of the people there, is that he was basically asking them to make a choice, that they had to make a choice between himself or Vladimir Putin as far as the future leadership of the country. But I know many others didn't see it that way. What's your take on that?
Well, I agree with Alexander that Russia is a much more stable place now than the European Union or the United States, politically. Politically and economically, financially, I would say. As for Medvedev's statement a few days ago, I wouldn't read too much into it, because he didn't say anything about Putin. He just said that businessmen have to choose between the past and the future. And that's exactly what he said at the Yaroslavl conference about 2 years ago. This is his usual logo. He presents himself as the man of change, as the man of the most advanced people in Russia, the businessman. Putin presents himself as a man of stability. But in fact, they both serve their class, they serve Russian elite. And since the West offers no European perspective to Russia, any kind of elite that comes to power will basically conduct the same foreign policy, since there is no choice left. Every elite will try to keep power and money, and at the same time it will try step by step to integrate itself into the Western European elite. As for the flight of capital, indeed it happens in Russia very often. The last flight of capital was when the crisis started. I think it's connected to the fact that Russia is so closely tied to Europe economically. We sell Europe our oil and gas. So when Europe is destabilized and there is a threat to the common currency, euro, then obviously some businessmen feel nervous also about Russia, and they try to turn their assets into cash again.
Indeed, a lot of nervousness about the current economic climate, not only in Russia, but throughout the world, through the European economy, as you said. But Dmitry Babich, I just want to follow up on what you said earlier about the discussion between business leaders and Dmitry Medvedev, because I think it's something that's worth getting into a little bit more. I know there were others who were in that room who interpreted it the same way you did, that this was basically a man who was perhaps not too sure about whether he's going to run for president, and he was quite vague on this. But the question then becomes, if people who heard him can't agree on what it was he actually said, then doesn't that just further contribute to the uncertainty?
No, I don't think so, because I think these people's reading something into Medvedev's words that he didn't say. This tendency stems from wishful thinking. There is a lot of people in the West, and there is a lot of people also in Russian business elite, who would love to see Putin and Medvedev quarrel really badly. And they would like a remake of what we had in the late 80s, early 90s, when Politburo members quarreled. One of them went to support Armenia, another one went to support Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some businessmen would like to catch some fish in the muddy waters. But I don't think it will happen, simply because Putin and Medvedev saw how it happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And before coming to power, I would remind you, Medvedev gave a very long interview to the Expert magazine, where he actually warned against a conflict inside the elite. He said this is something that we should not allow to happen. So I think basically they will never, I mean, these people, these two men can have differences in style, but they will never allow their differences to endanger the stability and the hold on power of the elite in general.
James Moore, I want to get your take on this. As someone who has dealt with Russian business leaders and political leaders, what are investors likely to expect when they invest their money in Russia? Obviously, they want a return on their money. That goes without saying. But what is it that they should be wary of in 2011?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that what we're experiencing over these past few days is a parlor game in regards to what's happening in the Kremlin that's gone on since the moment that President Medvedev actually became president. This is something that just is not new, and intrigue is nothing new to the Kremlin. At times throughout this period of President Medvedev's administration, he's played good cop to Vladimir Putin's bad cop, and sometimes I think it's been planned, and other times I think it hasn't been. But businesses aren't just concerned right now about what's transpiring in the Kremlin. They're very concerned about the business climate in Russia. Back in 1988, I was the chief negotiator for the United States in what turned out to be the last trade and economic agreement with the Soviet Union. And what we did was to put together a series of joint ventures with different industries to be able really to try to bring Russians and other members of the former Soviet Union into the Western fold, to be able to teach them what it was like to be involved in a non-central command economy. One of the most important joint ventures, quite frankly, that we put together was one dealing with the legal systems, about how important it was to have an independent judiciary, how important it was to have transparency, how important it was to have a series of laws that could be understood and dealt with for foreign businesses wanting to invest in the former Soviet Union. And unfortunately, that's been a generation ago, and we've continued to have serious problems where there really are concerns on the part of businesses, not only for doing business and being able to make a profit in Russia, but also exactly how are their rights going to be able to be upheld.
All right, I want to pick up on a couple of things that you said there, and I want to put this one first to Alexander Nekrasov in London. What James Moore was saying earlier, that this perceived political tussle that's apparently going on between the Russian president and his prime minister, is it a parlor game, as James Moore has suggested? Is this all just perhaps a front to give the illusion that there is a robust political debate going on in Russia, and that the truth is that it's Vladimir Putin who's really in charge here? Do you see it that way?
Well, I see it that Vladimir Putin was always in charge, and I can't understand all those stories about clashes between Medvedev and Putin. You can look at the people who work in the Kremlin. Most of them have been working with Putin. That basically in Russia, that tells you everything. And if Medvedev makes some sort of a comment which we were talking about, it doesn't really mean anything. Medvedev is on his way out. That is obvious, and that was the plan right from the start. The Russian business elite will not be happy with Medvedev simply because he is not seen as a strong leader, and Russia needs a strong leader, whereas Putin is able to provide the sort of stability that Russian business community needs. And as regards for the lack of legal system, I agree with James on that. Yes, of course, there are many problems with the judicial system and other problems that prevent some of the Western business from going in. But I also think there's a problem of perception, and the perception of this sort of corrupt country where you can't do any business, you have to pay off officials. I think it's false. I think it's being exaggerated. I think that the Kremlin has made a crucial mistake of hiring those PR whiz kids who in the West who are basically causing more problems to Russia rather than solving it. And as regards the advice that James was mentioning in the 1980s and 90s, I'm sorry to say, but the American advisors in the Kremlin gave such appalling advice on the economy. If memory serves me right, some of them were actually making a lot of money behind the scenes. And when we had to deal with these matters, we found ourselves in a very difficult situation because this advice was actually wrong, was not correct, was not proper. And if we look at the financial crisis in the West, we can actually say that, I'm sorry guys, but you don't really know how to run your things as well. Because look at the rotten, corrupt international banking system that you didn't even change, which is still there, which is causing another crash, which is coming next year. And you are going to tell the Russians how to run their things. I'm sorry, that doesn't work like that.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow. Is Medvedev on his way out?
I agree with what Alexander says. I would only disagree a little bit about Medvedev's personal perspectives. I think he will stay for another term. Well,
but
the
will
real
he really be in
power
charge, though?
behind the scenes, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. The real power behind the scenes will continue to be Putin, but Medvedev may stay for another 5 years, and I'll explain you why. Basically, the Russian elite has two priorities which conflict each other. One is to keep the power and money with the elite, and the other one is to integrate this elite into the Western elite, into the larger world. So Putin is responsible for the first priority, the most important one, and Medvedev is responsible for the second priority. And Medvedev has been doing pretty well because he didn't make any major concessions, but he looked much nicer than Putin during his pretty short tenure. And I don't see any reason why they would not, stay with that arrangement for the next 5 years. But in the rest, I agree with Alexander completely. I think the current financial system, international financial system, is undemocratic by definition. And when we hear that if we introduce American-style laws and regulations, we are going to have everything nice, I'm not sure about that because it didn't work in the United States. Why should it work here? So basically, I think Medvedev will stay, but the real power will be with Putin. And what is more, the real power will be with the political class that controls Russia now.
Dmitry,
and I don't see any alternative to this.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to, if I could just play devil's advocate here for a moment, if I could. There is a school of thought that says, given Russia's turbulent history, especially what happened in the Yeltsin years, all of the chaos in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians value stability above all else, political and economic stability. And it might come with an iron fist, it might be rammed down the people's throats, but it's better than the alternative. What's your take on that?
I agree completely, but it's not only Russians. The business around the world prefers stability to unpredictable change. Look at China, look at India, look at other countries where the Western businesses prefer to invest. They invest in stable countries.
But my point is, if that stability comes at the expense of people's basic rights, the right to free speech, the right to assembly and protest, free press, all of those sort of things, are those things that they are willing to sacrifice in the name of stability in the country, economic and political?
Well, Russians are very different. There is a part of the population that doesn't want this kind of forced stability. I agree with you. But they can express themselves in Russia via newspapers, via internet, via 1 or 2 television and radio channels. Basically, in Russia, we have a freedom of word. We don't have a freedom of political action. It's very difficult to found your own political party, get it registered, and participate in elections. And that changed under Putin. But the majority of the population, I agree with you, they want stability above everything else because we have been veterans to everything in the last 20 years. We had 2 coups, we had several wars, we had a very, unpleasant, unending confrontation with the West. We had several economic crises. So people value stability, I agree with you. But this stability is not forced on us in a Stalinist way, as the Western press sometimes reports. It's a new society. And it's not very different from Western society, I would say.
James Moore, what's your take on Dmitry's, what Dmitry said earlier there? Does Russia still have a long way to go in terms of political reform and showing itself as a true democracy?
Absolutely, it has a long way to go. I think it's important to remember that President Gorbachev unleashed perestroika and glasnost at the same time, not one over the other. A very different model than what China, for example, has enjoyed over the past decade or so. I think it's important to realize that what Russia has done is create a hybrid, something that is unique to Russia, that they're going to have to be able to forge on their own. And what happens certainly in the coming coming in the coming weeks as to who will be president and prime minister. The question is it going to simply be the same, or is there really going to be a sense of that investors, international investors, and even Russian investors have a choice? It may not be that there is an optimum situation in the European Union or the United States or anywhere else, but what is the lesser of all of the evils? And if indeed the investment climates in other countries are better than exists today in Russia, that's where the investment will go. That's where the business people will ultimately be putting most of their money.
And do you think Russia still has great potential economically? I mean, it is clearly a country that is very rich in resources, in oil and gas, but is it perhaps suffering suffering from what some people call the curse of resources?
Absolutely. We're talking about a country that literally spans 11 time zones. It is rich, rich, rich in natural resources. But the future of Russia is not going to be wrapped exclusively in the future of natural resources. It's got to find ways to diversify. It needs to be able to really be a partner in the global economic system that relies not just on natural resources, but other things that are important to human capital.
Alexander Nekrasov, if I can turn back to you on this, is the business climate in Russia at the moment, is it still very uncertain for foreigners wishing to invest there?
Well, it is uncertain in a sense, but where is the certainty? Show me the certainty in Europe as a whole. And we live in times of turmoil. At the moment, there is, for example, an idea of creating an international financial market in Russia, and I'm actually helping with this project. And we are talking with some of the foreign investors, and some of them are saying to us that actually, yes, despite the problems, they are prepared to invest money into Moscow, into Russia, because despite the sort of occasional problem, there is still a way of making money there. And they are pointing to us and saying, look, times have changed. Europe has become unstable. America at the moment is in a very difficult situation, and we are actually turning our eyes to other countries. And on balance, they say we still think we can work in Russia. So with all the problems that we have been talking about, with all the problems that exist, there are still ways of working there. And maybe you should know the specifics of Russia in a bit, because some of the companies, foreign companies that come to Russia, they expect to be having some sort of a special treatment. Some of them actually, by the way, bend the rules themselves, and then they say, oh, it's corruption and so on. So I think, yes, there are differences in countries and the regions, and I think that, but overall, you can invest into Russia and you can work there.
All right, I just want to ask all three of you a quick question, just in the 2 minutes or so that we have left here. Predictions, perhaps, for what will happen next year, the Russian presidential elections. Who do you think we will see in charge by the end of next year? And when I say in charge, I mean whether it's president or prime minister, take your pick. Who do you think it will be? Alexander Nekrasov first.
Well, I think Putin will come back to the Kremlin, because this sort of tandem, as they call it, it doesn't really work for the people. The people don't understand this. There has to be a single leader in Russia. The Russians don't understand when there are separate leaders sitting here and there.
My crystal ball at the moment is very foggy, but I will say this, that for businesses who deal with uncertainty, uncertainty equals risk. And the question is, will this particular election allow the world to understand that risk is less than what it has been for the past several years in the former Soviet Union? Dmitry Babich?
I think Medvedev will stay the president and Putin will stay the prime minister, unless the United States makes more effort to remove Putin from the race. That will have an adverse effect. You know, Vice President Biden made a huge mistake when he talked about it during his visit here. And if the West
it'll be interesting. It'll certainly be interesting to see what does happen, but that is going to have to be the last word. We are unfortunately out of time, and I want to thank all three of our guests for taking part in the discussion. Alexander Nekrasov, James Moore, and Dmitry Babich. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us anytime at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.